Yeah, so I'm going to talk about some experimental work that I did a few years back, and also the theory behind that experiment, where we obtained mode resolved scattering information for phonons in semiconductors. I'll talk about what these phonons are and so on in the next few slides. So as Urna introduced, I have just joined in January as assistant professor in IASE. And these are some of the funding agencies which have supported my past work through a graduate fellowship at Caltech, where I did my PhD, Resnick Institute, and also Department of Energy, Energy Frontier Research Centers. So just to give you a brief overview of my academic background, so I did my undergraduate degree in mechanical engineering at IIT Madras. Then I went to Caltech to do a PhD in mechanical engineering. Then I spent 3 years in the physics department at Boston College for my postdoctoral fellowship, and then now I am back at IAC as an assistant professor. So, okay, so what do I do? So my research focus is on developing new computational and experimental tools to probe the microscopic quantum mechanical interactions among energy carriers, particularly in solids, that is crystalline solids. So using these tools, I have worked on projects such as materials discovery for thermal heat conduction, thermal transport, where we are able to use a very new first principles technique to quantitatively predict unusual thermal properties of new materials. For example, my recent work has highlighted the very unusual thermal properties of two relatively new materials, boron arsenide, and also isotopically enriched boron nitride crystals. You can read more about these in these papers. Today, I'll basically not focus on that topic, but focus on a different topic, really measuring experimentally phonon-specific information for heat transport. So, using these experimental tools, I have worked on, for example, measuring how heat scatterers scatter at a material surface. For example, this is a ultra-high resolution TEM image, which shows atomically flat surface of a silicon membrane. And using these tools, I have worked on how heat carriers scatter at these rough surface. So I'll focus on the experimental technique, the theory behind it, and also how we did these measurements. So before I go into the details of the experiment, I'll give you a quick primer on what the heat carriers are. If you already know about it, yeah, just bear with me for 10 minutes. So heat conduction is a non-equilibrium process. So you take any material, you subject it to a hot and a cold end, that is, you impose a temperature gradient. Heat carriers will try to equilibrate the temperature difference between the hot and the cold end by transporting heat energy through the material. Typically, this transport of heat by these carriers happens in a diffusion process, where these heat carriers collide with each other as they transport heat from the hot to the cold end. So my interests really lie in looking at how the heat carriers transport heat through a solid material, such as semiconductors, metals, or other crystalline materials. Basically, what are the heat carriers in these solid semiconductors and metals, and give a microscopic perspective of how heat conduction happens through these materials. So what are these heat carriers in semiconductors? So if you Google semiconductor silicon, you will see these large macro scale single crystal pictures. But this is, I think, a picture taken in Intel like 20 years back for a single crystal boule of silicon. But if you really zoom into these single crystals, what you see is actually just a periodic array of atoms which are placed in a periodic fashion and interacting through effectively springs. So whenever you think of spring mass systems, immediately you can imagine vibration of these spring mass systems. And the collective vibrations or lattice vibrations called phonons are the primary heat carriers through most semiconductors. Yeah, this is, I think, a single crystal, very high quality single crystal. Yeah, silicon you can now grow to very high purity. Sorry? Yeah, it's I mean, I'm 2 meters tall, so I think this is more than 2 meters. So yeah, so now the technology is very advanced that you can grow these kinds of crystals even for other materials. This is 20 years back, I think. Anyway, so yeah, so the phonons, which are just collective excitations of these spring mass systems, are the ones which carry heat through semiconductors. To give you a more mathematical flavor of what these phonons are nothing but just the eigenmodes of an ideal harmonic spring mass system. So these ideal harmonic lattices can vibrate, and the eigenmodes of the vibrations are the phonons. And because these are governed by a harmonic potential, the eigenmodes turn out to be just plane waves, and these phonons are just these plane waves. So when I say plane waves, you have certain properties such as the temporal frequency nu omega, and also the spatial wave vector q, which is just 2 pi over lambda. So these are the fundamental properties of phonons. In fact, these phonons are precisely the ones which carry sound energy through crystals if their wavelength lambda is much longer than the spacing between the atoms. But what I am really interested in are those phonons which have wavelength comparable to the lattice spacing. So when lambda is very small, those are the phonon modes which carry heat through semiconductors. There are also other properties. For example, in these plane wave phonons, the omega temporal frequency is related to the wave vector q through something called phonon dispersion. Now, if you have taken any dynamics class in your undergraduate or graduate studies, this should immediately ring a bell, because these curves are precisely the solutions of a spring wave equation through a spring mass system. So if you take a one-dimensional periodically arranged set of atoms connected by harmonic springs, you can solve the wave equation through this 1D spring mass system, and you get frequencies related to the wave vector through these dispersion curves. You can make this problem slightly complicated. You can add one more atom to the unit cell, the different mass, and because now you have additional degrees of freedom, you get another branch of the dispersion. So for the low frequency branch is typically called the acoustic phonon because it's lower in frequency, and the higher one is called the optic phonon. So this is this typical dispersion that you get for a one-dimensional spring. If you have 3 dimensions as in real materials, you have 3 acoustic phonons and 3 optic phonons. This is basically the fundamental understanding of what phonons are in a material. There are also other properties that I'll just quickly go through. For example, since we are looking at heat conduction, we are interested in looking at how fast these phonons can transport heat through the material, and that's given by the group velocity. The group velocity is it's a phonon specific property. It changes for each phonon mode, and it's just given by the slope of these curves. Now, I introduced phonons as the eigenmodes of a perfect harmonic lattice. But in reality, no crystal is perfectly harmonic. There are always anharmonicities to the potential. And whenever you have anharmonic components to the potential, the eigenmodes necessarily have to interact and undergo damping. So these damping mechanisms are driven by what are called phonon-phonon scattering processes. So you can have in a solid, because of the anharmonicities, you can have interactions among 3 phonons at a time, which is a 3-phonon process. You can have interactions among 4 phonons at a time, and so on. So a sum total of all of these various allowed scattering mechanisms in a solid is given for a given phonon mode is given by this quantity gamma, which is just the total scattering rate. So why am I introducing all these quantities is because from kinetic theory, we can use these quantities and calculate the thermal conductivity of any material. So this is an expression directly taken from kinetic theory, where you have the thermal conductivity of any material written as a sum over all phonon modes in the crystal structure. So Q is an index for the wave vector, and J is just the polarization, which marks J equals 1 is this one, J equals 2 is this one, and so on. So you have 6 different modes in this case. The functions here are actually derived either from this curve or this curve. So heat capacity C is just a unique function of the phonon dispersion and temperature. V, as I said, is the group velocity of the phonons. Again, it's the same V, and gamma is the scattering rate. So when you have all these quantities for a given material, in principle, you can calculate the thermal conductivity of that material. So there's also another form which may be more familiar to you. So V over gamma has a unit of length, and that's given by the mean free path of phonon. So thermal conductivity K is written as a sum over individual phonon modes in the solid, CV times the mean free path. So the idea is if we have these quantities from some source, we can calculate the thermal conductivity of any material. And there has been very successful efforts to do precisely that. So people use density functional theory based first principles calculation, people including me, use density functional theory calculations to calculate thermal conductivity of many materials without any adjustable parameters. So this first principles theory essentially composes of just having very little information about the crystal structure. That is, what are the atoms that go into the crystal structure and what is the interaction of these atoms, what are these springs essentially. That's it. If we just have these two informations, we can drive it through the density functional theory machinery and calculate properties such as phonon dispersions, the scattering rates, which I showed earlier, very accurately for any material without any adjustable parameters. And once we have these two quantities, we can actually put this through this kinetic theory expression and calculate the thermal conductivity of any material. So for example, this is one of the earliest works by my postdoctoral advisor where he used this machinery to quantitatively predict the thermal conductivity of silicon and germanium, which are common semiconductors, over a broad temperature range. So I want to re-emphasize that the whole machinery here has no adjustable parameters, so it's completely predictive. Okay, so this framework not only works for silicon and germanium, it has been shown to work for a large class of materials. For example, for diamond, gallium nitride, diamond nanowires, and some of my works also. So I have now explained a forward problem. So we are calculating these phonon-specific quantities from density functional theory, and using this kinetic theory expression, we are calculating the thermal conductivity of any material. So how do we verify this framework, or how do we, in other words, how do we get phonon-specific quantities in an experiment? So that's basically what I'm going to talk about in the next few slides. So in an experiment, typically what you can measure is the thermal conductivity. That is the left-hand side of this equation. So for example, one of the works that we did was to measure thermal conductivity of a variety of materials, but this is just a single number. At a particular temperature, you get a single number. But if you want to get these quantities here, which are phonon-specific, you can clearly see that it is an ill-posed problem. More precisely, if we want to get the mean free path, which contains all the scattering information that phonons undergo in a material, this problem is fundamentally ill-posed. Why? Because you have a single equation for thermal conductivity, but you have a large array of unknowns. So it's not possible to invert this equation. So more physically, I like to explain it in a different way. I like to explain it in the following manner. Because this equation here describes a diffusion process, it's a memoryless transport of phonons. It's basically describing the random walk and how the energy is transported through random walks and collisions. So naturally, the memory is lost. So for example, there is no tuning parameter here with which you can create like independent equations with which you can get the mean free path or any other phonon-specific information. And that's all because the transport process in this case is a diffusion process. So naturally, a question will arise at this point. Can we overcome this diffusion barrier and figure out ways of transporting heat in a non-diffusive manner so that you can get phonon-specific information in an experiment? So the answer is, of course, yes. We can go to a non-diffusive transport regime and get phonon-specific information, and explain to you how that is done. So to start with, let's think about what Fourier's law really says. So Fourier's law here describes the heat current Q is proportional to a temperature gradient, delta T over L, where L is the sample length. And the proportionality constant, which is a material specific property. It's not a property of any of these variables, but it's a material property, that is thermal conductivity. So an interesting observation that you can make is as L goes to 0, if you make the sample smaller and smaller, Fourier's law predicts that heat flux diverges, which is unphysical, right? In fact, that is the case because in the experiments, typically you don't see diverging heat flux. So I like to explain that through a simplistic model. Let's take a material where all phonons in the material have a single mean free path for simplicity. So here I am showing a process where heat is conducted from a hot to a cold end through a diffusion process, because L, that is the distance between the hot and cold ends, is much longer than any mean free path. So phonons can undergo several collisions before they go from hot to cold end. So it's a diffusion process. And in this case, the heat flux that you typically measure in an experiment is actually consistent with what Fourier's law predicts. So I'm sorry you cannot see this, but I am trying to draw a dashed black line over this red curve. And till this point somewhere here, the heat flux measured in the experiment agrees with Fourier's law's prediction. And lambda is the mean free path of all phonons in the material. Now imagine what happens when I try to bring the hot and cold end closer together such that the length scale is now comparable to the mean free path. Now you can see that the number of collisions are becoming fewer. So the diffusion, so the transport is deviating from a diffusion process. So what happens is in the heat current that you measure is actually lower than what Fourier's law predicts. Now delta T and L are fixed for both cases. Q actual is smaller than Q Fourier. So K effective that you measure will be smaller than the bulk thermal conductivity. And that's what you see here. As the length scale is becoming smaller, the thermal conductivity starts dropping down. In the limit where the hot and the cold ends are very close together, such that L is much smaller than lambda, the heat flux actually in reality saturates to a constant value, but L goes to 0, so the effective thermal conductivity also should go to 0 for the equation to be valid. So this regime where there is no scattering possible or very few even number of scattering events possible is not a diffusion regime, but it is actually called quasi-ballistic because it is somewhere in between fully ballistic and fully diffusive. So it's called quasi-ballistic regime by convention. So this is a hypothetical material where all phonons have only one mean free path, and this is what you would see in an experiment when you measure thermal conductivity. Now what happens in a real material? Yeah, I'll show some data later. You will, I mean, I'm just exaggerating the curve here, but you will see that thermal conductivity is now no longer a property of a material, but it changes with length scale in this manner. So in a real material, what happens is you won't have a single mean free path, but you have a spectrum of mean free path for phonons. So to show this spectrum, we usually represent this transport capability using this accumulation function. So what it means is, you remember I showed K is sum over all phonons of C 1 over 3 CV lambda. This is basically a cumulative function of that particular equation. So essentially what it means is phonons with mean free, up to mean free path, say for example this value, contribute so much to that total thermal conductivity. Now in the diffusion regime, when L is much longer than lambda, you typically have the L here sitting over here, and experimentally you will measure the total accumulated value, right? In an experiment, you will measure the contribution from all phonons, which means the thermal conductivity you measure here is equal to this accumulated value. And because L is much longer than any lambda in the material, you measure the total bulk value that we all know for any material. Now, as you bring the hot and cold ends closer together, the phonons which have mean free path much longer than L now are transporting heat in a ballistic manner, which means their contribution is getting suppressed significantly. So you see here there is no accumulation happening in this region. And for phonons which have mean free path somewhat comparable to lambda, there is a suppression. So even though this curve is increasing, but it is increasing at a smaller rate than the Fourier's law's prediction. And for phonons which have mean free path much smaller than L, the contribution is untouched. So this is what happens in a real material. So because now the total contribution, which is the integral over this curve, is smaller than the integral over the red curve, the observed experimental values will start dropping down as you make the hot and cold ends closer together. Now you can go further into this some more strongly quasi-ballistic regime, and you will see further reduction in the observed thermal conductivity. So to put this in a mathematical framework, what is really happening is the transport is changing into the quasi-ballistic regime, and also the expression for thermal conductivity is also changing. So you can actually solve this system through the Boltzmann transport equation for phonon transport, and you can get expressions for thermal conductivity such as this. So in the diffusion regime, you will get this precise expression for thermal conductivity. And when you go to this quasi-ballistic regime, you get a different expression where thermal conductivity is no longer a constant, but depends on L. And the L dependence comes from this function called the suppression function. So this function, you can show that is bounded between 0 and 1. This is all solutions from the Boltzmann equation. And because it's between 0 and 1, any length dependent thermal conductivity has to be smaller than the bulk thermal conductivity. So this suppression function contains the information to basically tune the transport property of each phonon from a diffusion regime to a ballistic kind of regime. Okay, so now we have a way to go from an ill-posed problem. Yeah. Yeah.
Then how do you use this kinetic theory result?
This is not a kinetic theory result, this is a result from Boltzmann equation, which is valid whether you have a diffusion process or a ballistic process. Only the Fourier's law is not valid when you have a diffusion process.
You need those scattering of
you can have ballistic transport in the Boltzmann framework, right? The right-hand side basically goes to 0. Yeah.
But this expression.
This comes from Boltzmann equation. You can show that in the diffusion regime, this comes from the Boltzmann equation. But if you have very less scattering, the expression morphs into.
This is usually a kinetic theory expression. It's the CV, V, and lambda.
Yeah. So you can see that if all S's are 1, you get this expression, right? So it's a special case of the Boltzmann equation. So if all S independent of lambda is equal to 1.
So you are considering after suppression, whatever it is below L, you are considering gas of those phonons.
No, we consider all phonons. So if the phonon's contribution goes to 0 because of the suppression, it will automatically disappear out of the sum. So this quantity S basically tells you how much of the transport is happening in a diffusion manner and how much is happening in a ballistic manner.
And this function you can compute
from Boltzmann equation. So when you solve the Boltzmann equation for this particular experiment, say, you will get this kind of a form for thermal conductivity. And in the limit where all phonons are transporting heat in a diffusion manner, the S function is uniformly 1. In which case, it just reduces to this equation.
So if you take the limit, it goes to very small, like it becomes ballistic, then does it, then one expects this Landauer formula.
Yeah.
And does it go to the?
Yeah, it goes to, yeah.
But there I thought it should depend on the, like the connection to the leads. And
Yeah. So assume that there is no contact resistance. We are looking at only the material that is transporting heat. Yeah. This is, Landau formulation also can be derived in some sense from the Boltzmann equation if you just remove the scattering term. Yeah. Okay, so now we have transformed an ill-posed problem by going into the non-diffusion regime to a relatively more well-posed problem. Basically, what I'm saying is you can do the experiment at different L's, and you can create a set of independent equations because S is independent of any of the properties that you have here. It independently depends on L. So you can tune S by just changing L, which means when you change L, you create a number of equations for this form. And if you have sufficiently large number of L's, then in principle, you can invert this function to get lambda. So you're transitioning an ill-posed problem to a relatively more well-posed problem. Okay, so we have a theoretical way of getting information on a phonon-specific level. So is there an experiment to do this kind of work? So of course there is. So there is an experiment called Transient Grating, which I built during my PhD work, which has the capability to optically change that L that I was talking about, which is the distance between the hot and the cold end. So what this experiment does is, this is a schematic of a thin membrane which is suspended in vacuum. So both the bottom and the top sides are vacuum, and this is just silicon. So when we optically excite the sample using 2 pump lasers, and the reason why we use 2 pump lasers is because we want to make it interfere on the sample, and because optical interference leads to this kind of profile, we are using 2 lasers. And you can see that on the sample, the light is, the interference pattern is absorbed as a temperature profile, and the temperature profile has a spatial variation. So this is how a spatial variation in the sample for the temperature looks like. Now clearly heat will flow from the hot to the cold end. So heat transfers from this crest to the trough of the sine wave. So now when you change the grating period, that is the oscillation period of this temperature profile, in essence we are changing the L of the sample length. So the way we change the grating period is just simply change the angle between the pump and the between the two pump lasers. So when you increase the angle between the two interfering pump lasers, the interference pattern will have a higher oscillation frequency. So by simply just tilting these green or green lasers to a larger angle, we can continuously tune the parameter L and measure the thermal conductivity of this material for each L. So here, for example, is some of the example signals I have shown from the experiment. So initially, when you pump the system with laser, you have optical excitation, which causes a temperature rise with time. And once the pump laser switches off, the heat that is accumulated as this sinusoidal pattern will start decaying in time. And the decay rate gives you a measure of how fast the heat is being diffused out, which is basically the diffusion coefficient that we want, or the thermal conductivity. Now you can see here that I have done measurements at these numbers are essentially the grating periods, which represent the different L's that I was talking about. So you can measure thermal conductivity at different grating periods. So now we have an experimental way of getting thermal conductivity at different L values, which is the grating period. Now, if we can evaluate this suppression function using Boltzmann transport equation, we can calculate, you can invert this equation and get phonon-specific information like mean-free path. So this is the recipe. You do experiments of thermal conductivity at different length scales, in this case grating period, and then invert this equation to get phonon mean-free paths or phonon-specific information. So this is the recipe that I have used. I'll just quickly go through some results or some experimental work that I have done using this technique.
Velocities you already know.
Yeah, so the velocity and the heat capacity, for my work, I used calculated results, but you can do measurements of both sound velocity and also the heat capacity. The phonon dispersions you can independently measure, for example, the neutron scattering. Yeah. But for my case, my interest is to just get this lambda, or actually in reality, the whole accumulated function, which I'll talk about later. So so one of the problems that I wanted to look at is what happens to thermal conductivity as the thickness of the material is decreased. So the Fourier's law or any other equation I showed you is really representing the thermal conductivity of an infinitely large sample, where only intrinsic scattering such as 3 phonon scattering and 4 phonon scattering will cause resistance to heat flow. But in a real material such as in real device such as thin film transistors, you are basically thinning down the material, which means apart from these intrinsic scattering, there is also scattering at the boundary or the surface. And this scattering process of phonons also adds to the thermal resistance, but it is not well understood in literature. So that's basically what I wanted to do. So take a thin film such as from here, and then find out what is the rate at which phonons scatter at the surface and what is its manifestation on thermal conductivity on a more microscopic phonon mode resolved level. So this kind of experiment has been attempted in the past from a different angle. So what they did was they actually systematically reduced the thickness of the silicon membrane. So by reducing the thickness, you increase the surface area to volume ratio, which means you increase the rate at which phonons scatter at a rough surface. So more scattering will mean smaller thermal conductivity. That's what you see in this figure. So these are a large number of volume of literature that I have accumulated for thermal conductivity as a function of film thickness for silicon. So you can see that when the film thickness is very large, more than 1 micron thick, the thermal conductivity is close to the bulk value. Just 5 minutes. And then as the thickness is reduced, the thermal conductivity starts dropping down. So, but this doesn't really give you any mode resolved information, right? So all of these are just thermal conductivity measurements. So you don't know which phonon is really getting scattered at the boundary and which phonons are not. So to give you a more detailed explanation, again I'm showing you the thermal conductivity accumulation as a function of now phonon wavelength. Wavelength is also another property with which you can tag the phonons. And these experimental points are, as I said, the total accumulated value. So these points will lie somewhere at the right end of the spectrum. So now clearly you can see the problem, and this curve here is the thermal accumulation function in the absence of any boundaries in the bulk material. So you can clearly see that this red curve here, red point here, can be reached in this route where only long wavelength phonons are preferentially scattered at the boundary and their contribution is reduced. Or you can go in the other route where preferentially short wavelength phonons are getting scattered at the boundary and their contribution is reduced. So which of these is the correct curve? That information is not available from this kind of data set. So that was essentially the aim of the work. So what is the correct curve for a given thermal conductivity, and how can we extract that entire accumulation function using this non-diffusive heat conduction technique? So for that, we basically grew thin film samples, such as the one shown here, which is just a silicon membrane, and used this transient grating experiment to get length-dependent thermal conductivity measurements. So for example, here I am showing a few plots at different temperatures for thermal conductivity of silicon. And you can see that the thermal conductivity is decreasing as the grating period is decreased. So these dots with the error bars are the measured thermal conductivities at 80 Kelvin and so on. And as you can see, when I go from 40 micron grating period to 10 micron grating period, the thermal conductivity is dropping down. Fourier's law actually says the thermal conductivity should be length independent. But what we are seeing is the thermal conductivity is strongly dependent on the length because fundamentally it's violating Fourier's law's assumption. Okay, so we have this grating period dependent thermal conductivity, and by combining it with what we know about intrinsic scattering mechanisms, we are now able to extract the accumulation function for thermal conductivity for this membrane in the presence of boundaries. So this black line is theoretical calculation of how the thermal conductivity is distributed among different phonons, and this gray curve here is basically what is happening in the membrane itself in the presence of boundary scattering. So you can clearly see that this gives very rich information about how different phonons are getting scattered at the boundary. More specifically, you can see that the short wavelength phonons are not getting affected a lot by the boundary, and also in the long wavelength regime, these two curves are roughly running parallel with the error bar. So even the long wavelength phonons are not getting scattered at the boundary. All the reduction due to boundary scattering is happening in this mid-wavelength region. So this kind of microscopic phonon-specific information is possible with this experiment. And because such a phonon-specific information is available, we went one step further and tailored the surfaces of the membranes to different roughnesses. So these are two different high-resolution TEM images of silicon membranes, or two different silicon membranes. And we observed drastically different accumulation functions, precisely because the phonon scattering mechanisms in these two materials or membranes were very different. So in a smoother membrane, you get a higher thermal conductivity, and in the rougher membrane, you get lower thermal conductivity. So in summary, I hopefully explained to you how to get phonon-specific mode-resolved information from an experiment by using a non-diffusive heat conduction regime, by going from a diffusion to a ballistic kind of heat conduction regime. And I have explained the experiment that can really do this kind of transition from diffusion to ballistic transport. And with that, how we are able to measure boundary scattering of phonons in nanoscopic thin silicon film. So thanks for your attention, and I'll be happy to take any questions.